Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just remind you before we begin, please turn off your cell phones because they interfere with the dubious technological arrangements in Warren Auditorium. So that would be a great, they're also noisy if they go off, so it's a good idea. We're very happy to welcome back Professor Myrna Goodman to offer one of the most fundamental lectures in our series. Dr. Goodman received her doctorate in sociology from the great UC Davis, where her work focused on the Danish resistance and the rescue of Jews in Denmark during World War II. Prior to her retirement in 2013, Dr. Goodman was our academic coordinator for 12 years and did a wonderful job of securing the formidable reputation of this lecture series. She continues to this day to serve as the director for the Center of the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide here at Sonoma State. Over those 12 years and for many years before that, she has heard many, many accounts from witnesses, from rescuers, and from scholars of genocide and its effects. So it is very appropriate that she introduce us to Raphael Lemkin and the concept of genocide. Please welcome Professor Goodman.
Okay, first I want to thank you all for being here, especially the students, because I believe you know when you register for this class, you're in for some information that is not always available to you every day. This lecture is going to be on some level a little hard, because we're going to be talking about a very, very sad and awful part of our history and our current condition. But hopefully, with some knowledge, you'll be able to better understand what is happening and perhaps even, in your own little way, contribute to eliminating genocide. So, the goals for today are to define genocide. In any case, our goals for today are to define genocide, to describe the genocidal process, and to explore and understand how genocide is manifested in contemporary life. In addition to defining the process of genocide and its historical origins, which are very important to understand on some level, we will also examine it as a legal and punishable act. We will also consider how genocide can and does manifest it in our everyday world. So, important questions arise as we attempt an understanding of the concept of genocide. The word genocide did not exist before 1944. What the origins of the term and why it was essential to define it as a legal concept are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. In the shadow of the Holocaust, there was no specific legal concept that could specify the crime of the systematic destruction of a particular group of people. And unless a legal term was found and a jurisdictional court, a place where someone who was accused of the crime could be tried, perpetrators of mass killings could not be brought to justice. So genocide is a very specific term that describes violent crimes committed against groups with the intent to destroy the very existence of that group. It's an important definition. I'll repeat it. Genocide is a very specific term that describes violent crimes committed against groups with the intent to destroy the very existence of the group. It was not until 1948 that genocidal acts were formally criminalized in international law. So we're going to consider these questions. How is genocide defined? Why are definitions important? What's the nature of the genocidal process? And is it possible to intervene, impede, or stop genocide? The phenomenon of widespread murder was usually termed barbarism or inhumanity or mass death. Attempts in the 19th and 20th century to structure and classify those acts in an attempt to prevent war crimes took shape in international treaties that defined widespread murder as crimes against humanity. Examples were the Geneva Conventions, which forbid the murder of POWs, combatants not trying to sink passenger liners, but these treaties were not effective in preventing large-scale mass deaths. Okay. Genocide did not begin with the Holocaust. It has been a factor in human history from, well, historians date it from the 4th century BC. And as you can see, it has taken several different turns. Many of the things that happened were religious in nature. You can see in 1859 we had genocide, which happened right. Well, if we were up to it, we could hike to some of the places where the native peoples of California were murdered and slaughtered. The first genocide of the 20th century was in 1907 in Southwest Africa, where the Germans obliterated the Hereros, which were a native people in South Africa. In 1915, we had the genocide of the Armenians. Is anybody from Southern California? How many of you have heard of the Armenian genocide? Well, that's good. You'll hear more. In the early 1930s, the Russians starved well over 1 million people to death because they were political enemies, but they lived in what's called the breadbasket of Europe. And the Soviets took their grain, and so millions of people starved to death. Of course, we know about the Holocaust. And as you can see, following the Holocaust, there's a very incomplete list of all the places in the world that have experienced genocide. So let's begin by discussing the details of the Armenian genocide. It's important to know about the Armenian genocide because, as I mentioned, it was the first one of the 20th century, but many of the things that occurred in the Armenian genocide were precursors to other genocides, even specifically the Holocaust. During this series, we will study the causes and effects of several genocides, in addition to the Holocaust. Lecturers will explore the Armenian, the Rwandan, and Bosnian genocides. They will also consider genocides that are happening in the contemporary world. But we begin our study with the Armenian genocide, the first of the 20th century. To this day, the Turkish government refuses to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. But while the genocide was actively taking place, the American ambassador, Robert Morgenthau, Henry, his son was Robert. And then there's another one. They have very illustrious careers in our government. Henry Morgenthau, thank you, Doctor. He cabled his superiors in Washington and clearly described the Turkish campaign, and I quote him, "Persecution of Armenians is assuming unprecedented proportions. Reports from widely scattered districts indicate there is a systematic attempt to uproot peaceful Armenian populations, arbitrary arrests, terrible tortures, wholesale expulsions, and deportations from one end of the empire to the other. There seems to be a systematic plan to crush the Armenian race." They're not a race, but that was a term that was used then. The premeditated destruction of the Armenian people was intended to destroy humans, but the Turks also attempted to erase centuries-old Armenian culture. I believe the Armenians were the first group to embrace Christianity. They destroyed major objects of Armenian cultural, religious, historical, and communal heritage. That was a strategic purpose of the genocide. The premeditated massacre of Armenian people murdered between 1.2 and 2 million men, women, and children. As we've seen, the Geneva Conventions did not have a legal framework that allowed for prosecution of the perpetrators. It's surmised, and there has been some study, that German soldiers were observers of Turkish action in Armenia. And some of the methods that were used there were actually carried out during the Holocaust, and it was too similar to be just by chance. The Armenian genocide stands as probably our prototypical ideal of a denial. The Turks refuse to accept that they took part in genocide and have all kinds of excuses and different names. As I mentioned, the Ukrainian famine, 1932-33, also before any language was adopted that codified into law genocide. An estimated 7 million persons starved to death in the farming area of the Ukraine. It was known as the breadbasket of Europe. And the people who had grown the food with their own hands were deprived of it. Has anybody heard of the Nanking Massacre? You can see from this picture, there's a picture of some bricks at the Holocaust and Genocide Memorial Grove. Have any of you been by to see it? You have. It's over in back of the wine business building, which we long-term Sonoma State people remember as something else. The Nanking Massacre, known as the Rape of Nanking, was an episode of mass murder and mass rape committed by Japanese troops against the residents of Nanking, China, during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The 6 weeks of carnage would become known as the Rape of Nanking, and it represented the single worst atrocity during World War II in the Pacific theaters of war. In December of 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army marched into China's capital Nanking and proceeded to murder 300,000 of 600,000 residents. There is a memorial to the victims, as I mentioned. We have bricks in our memorial remembering the victims of Nanking. Of course, the Holocaust is the best known genocide in history. How many of you feel that you have a real grasp of what went on during the Holocaust? Or is this your first time to be exposed to the Holocaust? How many of you studied in middle school? Okay. And high school? Okay, unfortunately we don't have any courses in the history of the Holocaust at Sonoma State. Would be nice if we did. How many of you read Night by Elie Wiesel? Anne Frank's Diary? How many of you have seen The Pianist? Schindler's List? Okay, I'm finished. The Holocaust was the most destructive instance of mass death in the 20th century. The Nazis perpetrated what is known as the prototypical genocide. And by that I mean, if you look at a genocide, it will always have some elements of what went on in the Holocaust, but it will not have all of them. So we use it as a way of measuring genocidal action. The work of the scholar Raphael Lemkin, which you will hear about, is largely based on this murder of 6 million European Jews from 1933 to 1945. While Germans specifically targeted the Jews of Europe, other victims included, and I hope you'll remember that these people were also at risk, Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles, Russian POWs, and civilians, as well as the Roma and the Sinti. There were also gays and lesbians who were victims, communists, political opponents of the Nazis, as well as just plain citizens of all the countries of Europe. Now we learn about a great legal scholar and a man who is responsible for our struggle with the term genocide. And while his efforts were an attempt to define what had gone on, we can see the complications of modern society have made even his definitive definitions and the work of legal scholars still not, shall we say, perfected in terms of being absolutely certain of how to prosecute or whether someone or a country or a group of people are committing genocide. So 20th century events proved that there was no effective way to deter mass murder. And we turn to the consideration of Lemkin. He was born in eastern Poland. He grew up in a Jewish family in a town that is now in the Ukraine. The pogroms, do you remember pogrom from Professor Bittner's lecture? Small storms. They were, in some cases, spontaneous, but also planned attacks against the Jewish population of Eastern Europe and Russia. In any case, he grew up in that environment. The pogroms that he experienced as a young Jewish boy prompted his lifelong study of mass killing in history and the contemporary world as well. He wrote that as a child, he raced through an unusually grim reading list that familiarized him with cases from antiquity and the medieval era. I was appalled by the frequency of the evil, he said, and above all, by the impunity of the guilty, the outrageous actions of the guilty. Why was a question that began to consume him. A key moment for him came in 1921 when a survivor of the Armenian genocide stalked down one of the perpetrators of the genocide in Germany, who had been released without any punishment. And he recognized that the time was ripe for him to do something about helping to create some legal method of bringing perpetrators to justice. So he coined the word genocide. The word the modern world. It comes from geno, from the Greek word genos, which means birth, race, of a similar kind, and side, from the Latin sida, which means to kill or cut. To kill a group or a people of similar kinds. It was necessary to codify this. That is, to make a law or put in the law the terms in which genocide would be considered. You can't just say, you did genocide and we're going to sue you. You need to, prosecute you. You need to have some basis. Robert Mueller is doing that right now, isn't he? Because he has codified laws that say who is breaking the law, because the law is written. So the United Nations came up with a definition, and I believe this is in your text in the back, so don't worry about trying to write it down unless that's a convenient way for you to remember or you didn't buy the book. So genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring the children of the group to another group. Have any of you taken Native American studies? What happened to the Native peoples, to the children? Yes? They were taken from their families and put in boarding schools, right? That's only one part of our consideration as to whether our actions against the Native Americans were genocidal. That's a lot. So some social scientists have hoped and did come up with a simpler definition. And that is, genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrators. It's a very broad definition. I have read more than 21 other scholarly attempts to provide a more precise description of genocide. Why do scholars do this? Well, they are attempts to clarify the ambiguities that are always present in the UN Convention. Also, often they represent the unique features that scholars wish to highlight. So for our purposes today, either one of the definitions, the UN, or the social science designation will suffice. So, how do we know when genocide is happening? Dr. Gregory Stanton, the president of the human rights group Genocide Watch, proposes that we think about genocide as a process that develops in 10 stages. The stages are predictable, but not inevitable. And at each stage, the process can be halted. The process is not linear. You don't go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. You can move back and forth before you get to persecution or extermination. But the later stages must be preceded by the earlier stages, and all the stages continue to operate throughout the process. So understanding this process is one of the most important steps in preventing future genocides. So the first 6 stages are early warnings. Stage 1 is classifications. You see there Nazis measuring ears and the Belgians in Rwanda measuring noses. All cultures have categories to distinguish people between us and them. We do it by ethnicity, by race, religion, nationality, gender. If societies are too segregated or divided, they are most likely to have genocide. The main way of preventing genocide at this early stage is to develop opportunities in a society for people to work and live together. This will allow people to become more tolerant and understanding of each other. In the United States, public schools are supposed to serve that function, as they are places where all young people can go regardless of their ethnic, social, or religious backgrounds. And we all know that that ideal is not perfect. It's through that process that we reach common ground with each other. The second stage is symbolization. So we give names or other symbols to classifications of people. We name people Jews or Gypsies, or you can think of some of the others, or distinguish them by the colors they wear, or their dress, or the symbols that they might wear. Classification and symbolization are universally human and do not necessarily result in genocide. I mean, what would we do if we had genocide every time someone wore a Warrior shirt and someone else wore a Laker shirt? When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of outsider groups. The people in the eastern zone of Cambodia, in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, wore blue scarves, and they were attacked for that. We all know about the yellow stars that Jews were required to wear. It has quite an effect, group marking, that is. Now you can outlaw. They do it in the high schools all the time. My granddaughter cannot wear red or blue or something. But those limitations will fail if unsupported by popular cultural enforcement. Actually, Hutu and Tutsi were forbidden to be used in Burundi, but they were replaced with different terms. So the process still went on. If supported, however, denial of symbolization can be powerful, as it was in Denmark, where the government refused to issue a requirement that Jews wear the yellow star. The next stage is discrimination. It is when a dominant group uses law, custom, and political power to deny the rights of specific groups. The powerless group may not be given full civil rights or even citizenship. And I use this example of the Nuremberg laws of 1935 in Nazi Germany. They stripped the Jews of citizenship and prohibited their employment by the government and by universities. Now, this was 4 years before the war. Prevention against discrimination means that groups need to have full political empowerment and citizenship. Discrimination on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion should be outlawed. And individuals should have the right to sue the state, corporations, and other individuals if their rights are threatened. Stage 4 is dehumanization. And this occurs when one group treats another group as second-class citizens. Members of a persecuted group may be compared to animals, parasites, insects, or diseases. That's quite a common occurrence. When a group of people is thought of as less than human, it is easier for the group in control to murder them. And at this stage, hate propaganda in print and on hate radio is used to make the victims seem like villains. Generally, if a country is on the verge of committing genocide, it is no longer a democracy, if it even was before. And the broad freedom of speech in a democracy may be limited in such a country. Hate radio stations should be shut down to prevent genocide, and hate propaganda banned. Okay, stage 5 is organization. In order to kill large numbers of people, you need organization. Later in the semester, this foreshadows the lecture by Professor Waller, who's going to talk on becoming evil, and will directly address how people are recruited and convinced that this kind of work is proper and necessary. Stage 6, polarization. This is where extremists drive groups apart. Hate groups broadcast and print polarizing propaganda. Laws are passed that forbid intermarriage or social interaction, and political moderates are silenced, threatened, intimidated, and killed. All in which to fragment society. In stage 7, or preparation, members of victim groups are forced to wear identifying symbols. You can see the yellow star. Victims are separated and deported to concentration camps or famine-stricken areas, but they are separated from mainstream society. This happened in the Holocaust, it happened in Armenia, and it's happened in just about every genocide that has moved to completion. Stage 8 is persecution. Victims are identified and separated out because of their ethnic or religious identity. Death lists or lists of people scheduled to be murdered are drawn up. And in state-sponsored genocide, that of a government, members of victim groups may be forced to wear identifying symbols, which we talked about. One of our students grew up in Germany. Is she here? No. That sign says, Jews are not wanted here. Is that right? Huh? Jews are not wanted here? Unwelcome. Okay. Stage 9 is extermination. Extermination begins and quickly becomes the mass killing legally called genocide. It is extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. When it is sponsored by the government, the armed forces often work in private armies to do the killing. Sometimes the genocide results in revenge killings by groups against each other, creating downward-like a whirlpool cycle of mutual genocide where the victims actually organize and commit a second crime. At that stage, only swift and powerful intervention can prevent the genocide. And stage 10 is denial. And it always follows genocide. Always. The perpetrators of genocide dig up mass graves. They burn bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidate witnesses. They deny that they committed any crimes and often blame what happened on the victims themselves. They block investigations of crimes and continue to govern until driven from power by force. Leaders of genocide continue to deny the crime unless a special court is established to try them. The best response to denial is punishment. but also education. So rather than go through a exhausting list of genocides after the Holocaust, I give you this list. Are you familiar with any of them? Someone familiar with them? Do they ring a bell? Or are they? Um, it does not occur in the literature. It isn't in the literature. I don't think it's been wiped. It may not have reached the test for genocide, but may be categorized as mass killing. But yes, there were horrible things that happened in Biafra. How many of you were alive in 1994? Okay, just little folks, huh? Except for the adults. The thing that I do want to point out to you is that we will be having speakers, if you look at your schedule, who will talk to us about Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur, as well as others who will consider the next list. But first I want to tell you about the International Criminal Court. So we talked about how there was no place to bring perpetrators of genocide to justice. But in spite of this establishment of an international tribunal at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, even I wasn't alive then, following the First World War, no international court was established until after the Second World War. Two ad hoc tribunals to prosecute the Axis powers, now that means Germany and its allies, were set up to try them. And their leaders were accused of war crimes. The international military tribunals, one sat, does anybody know where the first one sat? Tried the Germans? Nuremberg, Germany. And following also in the east, in Tokyo, Japanese leaders were prosecuted. Many people don't know that the Japanese were also involved in genocidal activity in Asia. One example is Nanking, and there are others. They also were doing chemical experiments on human subjects without their permission. In the early 1990s, the National Security Council, United Nations Security Council, established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993, as well as one for Rwanda. And following these, the General Assembly convened a conference in Rome. It is known as the Rome Statutes, and entered into force the International Criminal Court. And they have tried Serbians and are actively engaged with perpetrators from Cambodia. There are others, aren't there? Yes, there are. So, the famous cry after the Holocaust was what? Never again. As our good friend Jim Waller says, never again or ever again. These are some of the places where there is ongoing collective violence and genocide. Because genocide represents the extreme form of collective violence, it's imperative that we understand the entire range of collective violence in order to be able to clearly understand when collective violence has or will evolve into genocidal violence. Collective violence to genocidal violence. The areas, these are the areas where collective violence has or will eventually evolve into genocidal violence. How many of you have heard of the Sudan? Okay. The ISIS in Iraq. The genocide against the Yazidis in Iraq. Somalia. Central African Republic. That one's not as well known. Myanmar. Nigeria. Burundi. Syria. You should all know about that one. And Yemen. It's heartbreaking. The organization Genocide Watch has issued a genocide emergency for the regions of South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, and Darfur in the Republic of the Sudan. Similar to Darfur, South Kordofan and the Blue Nile have suffered long-term political and economic marginalization. Iraq genocide has issued a genocide emergency in Iraq. ISIS fighters who have already driven out Christians from their ancestral homes in northern Iraq have been especially targeting the Yazidis. You're familiar with that word? Yazidis? I'll get to that. The Yazidis are the latest victims of the brutal advance by the Islamic State. And they are a religious group. Let me see if they are members of a religious group, a minority. They were able to flee to a mountain from the onslaught of the Islamic State. The Yazidi faith, which combines elements of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is found in parts of Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. Adherents embrace reincarnation and essentially reject the concepts of sin and evil. Thus, there's no notion of either Satan or hell, and yet they're going through it. Anyway, they are the latest brutal victims of genocide. They are left, in many cases, without food or water when they flee to the mountains. And my notes show that about 200,000 of them have done that. Among other things, they've been beheaded, raped, and they have been sold into slavery. Genocide Watch has issued a genocide emergency for the Central African Republic. The continuing violence between the Christian majority and the Muslim minority, militias, has been genocidal because victims are targeted for their religious identity. Who, who is suffering in Myanmar? The Rohingya. Who's familiar with that term? Okay. So United Nations officials and independent human rights groups have reported evidence of direct state complicity in ethnic cleansing and severe human rights abuses, blocking humanitarian aid, and the incitement of anti-Muslim violence in Burma, or it was Burma, it's now Myanmar. The Rohingya Muslim ethnic minority in Burma have been called the most oppressed people on earth. They suffer vicious attacks and systematic abuse by the government. 1.3 million Rohingya have been denied citizenship and stripped of all their rights. They're forced to live in terrible conditions where they cannot travel, work, or even marry without permission.
Can I just add that it's the Buddhist majority that's repressing them?
Yes,
Which I think is kind of shocking to a lot of people when they
right.
heard that particular genocide.
Did you hear? It's the Buddhist. How's that? Is that better? I'll button it up here. Okay. It's the Buddhist majority that is subjecting the Rohingya to genocidal measures. And if that isn't ironic, nothing is. Yes? Yes. Are they Christians? Muslims. That's right. That's right. I mean, there's so many, it's hard to keep track these days. And I don't mean that as a joke. Then there's Syria. This conflict is not simply a civil war between opposing armed forces. What began as a democratic uprising against President Bashar Assad's regime has transformed into a violent struggle between local, national, regional, and international forces in which the Syrian government, extremist groups, and outside actors perpetrate atrocities against civilians as a systematic strategy of war. You heard of Syria, right? It's getting hard. You need to take a deep breath. I do. Okay. Yemen is down there in the Gulf of Aden. This is another pretty awful situation. It's the poorest country in the Persian Gulf, and indeed in the whole Middle West. And it has long been neglected by the international community. It could not stand in starker contrast with their glitzy neighbors, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of those oil-rich states. Over the past 2 years, it hit the headlines for the most tragic of reasons. For many months now, the situation in Yemen has been described by the UN as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Whereas the country was poor before the war, mostly due to corruption, civil war, and economic mismanagement, the country remains in the grip of a war that is becoming increasingly complex. It is essentially between the Houthis and the government forces. But the war has been joined by the Saudi-led coalition, which is backed by the United States, Great Britain, and France, as well as a number of Gulf countries. Opposing the coalition is Iran, and they are aiding the Houthis. The most serious humanitarian concerns include famine and cholera. The children of Yemen are starving to death. Outside organizations are having a difficult time getting in to provide aid. The UN Humanitarian Aid Office estimates that 10 million Yemenis need emergency assistance, and millions of others are struggling to secure water, food, and any form of shelter. The famine further stems from the Saudi-led coalition's blockade on food imports. Even after loosening the blockade, Yemenis are still cut off from accessing aid. Are you worn out? I am. It's awful to have to confront all of this because we live in such a fractured world. But there's a way to look at the world that perhaps has us re-examining how we can judge our common humanity. After an extensive study of the social climate in European countries during the Holocaust, sociologist Helen Fine concluded that the most important factors were based on the shared values and standards in a society. She discovered that the more likely Jews and others were considered members of the same group, of the same government, or citizens of the same country, the more likely they were to find themselves in the universe of moral obligation. Fine's evocative phrase holds true today, and it is an important idea that should shape our understandings of the necessary responses to the threat of harm toward vulnerable groups. And I would say that no time is it more important also in our country. The universe of moral obligation is that person, that circle of persons toward whom obligations are owed, to whom the rules apply, and whose injuries call for attention and healing. It is real easy in times like these, both here and after hearing about what goes on in the world, the larger world, for us to just say, it's too much. I'll just go watch the Kardashians. I don't, by the way, watch the Kardashians. It's a reminder to us that we do have obligations to others, be they just our family, just our friends, just our own groups, just the citizens of this country, to immigrants who are hoping to make a decent life for themselves. By being aware of all of this tragedy and studying, as I mentioned when we started, you put yourself in a very unique position because you can't close your eyes anymore. It's hoped that you will maybe share what you've learned with other people in addition to writing good exams. Because unless we remember and unless we think about what's going on, it's just going to keep perpetuating. And for those of you who think that one person can't do or make a difference, it's always been my thought that it's better to make some effort than none. It doesn't have, the things that we do not have to produce success. So, these are 3 organizations that I know. There are many, many more that do work in areas where current genocides are going on. I know that as a former professor with a pension, that I can make my donations to those places, but it is possible just to learn from those websites the things that people are doing so that you can have some sense that it is not hopeless. There are millions of people who are contributing in one way or another, either with their money or with their time or by spreading information. And I think it's the best we can do, generally. Thank you for your attention. Questions? Yes? We have a microphone, and if you'll wait for... Oh, yeah. Wait.
I believe the Germans have made an effort to reverse the denial. Is that a step in the right direction, do you think?
From the very beginning, the Germans never denied. They accepted their part. They've gone, Germans, perhaps more than any other country, have accepted their part in the Holocaust and have made many, many measures to try and make amends. And I think they realize that that's never going to happen, but they still keep trying.
Oh, I thought you raised your hand.
Having had the fortune to read your dissertation, I noticed what the Danish people did, and my question would be, being that you're in touch with a lot of the recent scholarship, is there a hope for, you might say, tolerance and cooperation amongst religious sects, especially in regards to Judaism and the Haredi experience in Eastern Europe? Do you see hopeful things occurring, or is there more of a trend to just want to do away with all previous religious activity?
It depends. In some places, it's pretty remarkable the way religious groups have come together to foster relationships between Jews and Christians and other religions. You don't hear it because you're not digging down deep, but there are any number of Muslim groups in this country that are fully engaged in civic betterment. And just over the last month, there were mosques that were opening up and serving food to federal workers. And every time there's a tragedy, like the one in Philadelphia at the synagogue, the Muslim organizations in that same area were very instrumental in trying to help the families who were affected by that. So there are still some places in the world where it is difficult for Jews, increasingly so, because there are, unfortunately, increased anti-Semitic activities going on Europe, United States, in all different places. But some religions are not as, shall we say, as connected with ecumenical feelings, and I don't want to mention who they are.
Read a magazine called The Tablet, which brought up the subject of the psychological state of haters. And it basically said for haters, hating is a form of pleasure. Yeah, but it's a form of pleasure, and that we don't seem to have organized any equally powerful psychological response to the pleasure of hating.
Tried to stay away from is making any assumptions about psychological causes and effects of genocide. It's just not my area, so I don't know much. Okay. You're just making a statement, is that it?
That I read, and wondering if you had any comment. What it was saying, it was a form of pleasure, and we have not come to an adequate response to that form of darkness, if you will. Tablet magazine online this week.
I have a question for you. At what age do you think it's appropriate to start talking to children about genocide? Just wondering. I have my little sister's 9 years old. She's very smart. She loves to read, but I'm just wondering, like, at what age is it okay to introduce these issues, especially with everything going on in the world today? Just like a personal, you know.
To say that there is a specific time. There are some children's books that talk about, the subject matter is about, for younger children, the subject matter is about Denmark. And in exploring the rescue of the Danish Jews, there is a slight introduction to the whole notion of prejudice and not so much genocide, but threats to people from groups. And if you will send me an email at goodman@sonoma.edu, I'll send you those titles. I don't have them, the authors, right in my head. So send me an email and I'll be glad to send you those. Because I've given them to my grandchildren, my young grandchildren.
Okay. Two quick questions about that have a connection to
the reparations that Germany had been offering Israel and the Jewish people, and perhaps I'm just wondering if other nations that were conducting genocides have seen that as something that they don't want to go in that process. Therefore, perhaps say the Turkish denial of what they're doing, and because they do not want to get into such a process of then compensating. And about Turkey, I mean, you didn't really mention that one of the problems here is that there is no international agreement, perhaps, about this about the genocide because of political reasons. You see that the United States, Israel, and other countries refuse to recognize this genocide for political reasons because of their relations with Turkey. And every time there are tensions between Turkey and any of these countries, all of a sudden you see one of the politicians bringing to their parliament a resolution that then falls because Turkey is too important. So how about the political aspect of recognizing it, and perhaps in parallel to other countries that I'm less familiar with, other genocides? I mean, international political reasons for not recognizing such a thing. I mean, in retrospect.
If the Turks were forced, or yes, forced, that's the way it kind of is, to pay reparations to the Armenian people, they'd go bankrupt because so much of Armenia was, the Armenian people lost so much. It's also, you know, one of the reasons that I look to humanitarian organizations, and I exclude myself, the UN, pretty much, is because I know that politics enters into all of the discussions about who did what and what needs to be protected. The Armenian situation is a very good example. Every presidential candidate since who, Christine, would you say? Okay, but everyone after Reagan. Clinton. Right. But they also promised they're going to do something before they're elected. So the Armenians repeatedly get this horrible action towards them where there are promises and then they are betrayed again. But you're right. Nobody forced Germany to do it, but politics did, because if they wanted to be a part of Europe again, they really had to clean up their act. But I think most of it was really sincere. And as far as other nations doing reparations, I think some of them have been forced. I think the French have now said that they will reimburse people or families for the tickets that people had to buy to be transported to Auschwitz. So, yes. Everybody who went to Auschwitz from Western Europe had to buy their own ticket. Just about. Yeah. No, that's okay.
It's more of just a tacking on to that last discussion, but one of the cases that you had listed up on one of the slides was East Timor, which was one that I don't think we talk about enough in genocide studies. It went on for almost 25 years. And it's an interesting case for a lot of reasons, but another is with how Indonesia, who was the perpetrator in that case, has dealt with it since. What they did was they set up what's called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. along the lines of what happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And yeah, and then subsequently in Rwanda, and there's also been TRCs in like Peru and Morocco and a few other places. But it's a really interesting example of this question of how do societies heal after something like this? Because it isn't, I don't think it's just about reparations or just about acknowledging the crimes. It's about like reintegrating people back into societies and trying to find ways to live together again. So there's some really good information out there for anybody who's interested in this subject on truth and reconciliation commissions and how they work. For my sections, we're going to watch a video on that later in the semester, so they'll see some of that anyway. But I just wanted to add that dimension to the conversation because that piece about, you know, finding ways to live together again, I think is really critical.
Is there a significant difference in character between genocide perpetrated by state actors and genocide perpetrated by non-state actors? And if so, which is worse? Or
telling you which one is worse. Genocide is genocide. I mean, if you want to know which is more extensive, obviously state-sponsored genocide because of the resources that they have. But individual groups and actors, you know, have very limited purviews. But state actors have a lot of resources that they can call to account. The stages are fluid. There are only a few that are set. You know, there's always denial.
So the question.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I believe your class saw the small, short video about what happened in Denmark. Who was in class and saw that? The other group is going to. Essentially, what happened in Denmark was the Germans occupied Denmark very early in the war. And rather than do what many countries did, the Danes just surrendered and said, okay. And the Germans and the Danes entered into a very tenuous agreement. The Germans left the Danish government alone, and the Danes didn't do anything to impede the Germans. Denmark was called Hitler's Canary, so you can kind of imagine what that was. And it was very pragmatic. The Danish people are very pragmatic. When they come across something, they think of very smart solutions to problems. So for a period of time, they just played along with the Germans. I had people tell me that when, especially people who were teenagers, I had one man tell me that every time a German soldier, asked him for directions in German, he'd go. But he had learned German in school. And so it became very associated with Danish democracy, that the Jews needed to be protected. because they believed that the Jews were members of civilization, of their country, of God's people. And so when word was spread, and it's a very complicated story, that the Germans were going to deport the Jews to Auschwitz, word went out, and over a month and a half, Jews were taken across the Sound to Sweden. Technological dope. Oh. I never refer to them as Jewish Danes. I always refer to them as the Jews in Denmark, which is what they prefer. I'll get to you. Oh. Wow. Good.
How does a terrorist organization like ISIS start?
Education. Tired of not having anything to do. I'm being facetious, but it's the truth. A lot of children are attending schools where they are taught to hate other people. In this country, who knows? Because we have as many terrorists in this country as because I consider some of the things that are being done with guns terrorist activities. Dennis.
About is louder. I'm talking loud. The reparations, coming up with the money. I don't know if it's millions of dollars or if Turkey would go bankrupt, because when I look at the value of my family who are Holocaust survivors, of their homes that were taken, of my grandparents that were murdered, of my aunts and uncles that were murdered, how do you come up with a number that justifies that, of them having to go through what they went through? So they gave my dad or my mom $200 a month, or some number that was arbitrarily decided upon. Germany didn't go bankrupt because of that. I'm sure Turkey could do a similar thing. They're not going to reimburse the Armenians for everything. They can't. How do you put a number on life? I don't know. But I don't think we're...
I said as far as reparations from the Turks to the Armenians, from our lips to God's ears, I am very skeptical about whether it'll ever happen. And it's, Turks have a lot of money. They could do it. There's so few people that are still, there are no survivors. Christine is of the third generation. How many second generation Armenians do you think are still alive? Right. Don't forget when the Armenian genocide took happened. Thank you.